Today, I want to test if you can use baking powder to reduce the acidity of your sourdough starter. Now, this is especially handy if you don't like your sourdough to be as sour. And some of you wrote that in the comments, and I thought, okay, I'm gonna test this and show you the results. This might be especially handy when you're baking with your discard sourdough starter, which you typically pile up after a couple of feedings. So let's give this a shot. I'm super excited to show you the results. Now, background story. Whenever you feed your sourdough starter, you sometimes have some leftovers. Some people call that discard starter. Nope. That's not a good word. Please never use the word discard starter again. This is slow fermented, precious super starter. Your flour has been broken down by the yeast and the bacteria. Now, I like to use that to bake a bread. I'm sharing the recipe right here. But some of you reported that it's sometimes a little bit too sour. Now, I like my bread very, very sour. I like that tang. But if you don't, then this might be a cool hack to reduce the acidity. Now, over time, the longer you ferment, the more the lactic acid bacteria is producing lactic acid and acetic acid. And this is what makes your sourdough more and more sour, which gives it the unique taste, but also prevents other pathogens from entering your sourdough starter. That's why your sourdough starter typically never catches mold. So anyways, you see that liquid here. Some people think, okay, I need to toss my starter because I'm seeing the liquid here. But that's actually rocket fuel. That's very, very much fermented flour. Some people call that the hooch. So this is nothing you should throw away. This is bacterial yeast water. And you see that? The bubbles popping up here, this is still very much alive. You can easily store this for a few weeks inside of your fridge. Now, okay, let's do the test. I'm gonna be putting a little bit of this. I'll add some baking powder and then let's measure the acidity. First of all, let's check the actual acidity of this dough. There are cheaper pH meters and there are also more expensive ones. The cheaper pH meter typically doesn't have a spearhead. This one has a spearhead and that makes measuring foods very, very simple. This one is also a little bit harder to clean up. The way how they measure the acidity is by checking the voltage which they have here at that probe. Same thing here. This one is around $20 and this one is around $300. So that's quite a big of a difference. You could also be using some pH strips that would definitely work as well. Anyways, back to the experiment. Let's check this. And look at that, pH is of 3.9. The lower the pH, the more acid you have inside. Now there's also a difference between actual acidity and perceived acidity, but that's for another topic. So 3.9, let's take some of that, mix that with the baking powder and see what happens. I'm just stirring the hooch back inside. Look at that. This is gold. Oh yeah, this is quite sour. But normally when you bake, while you're baking, some of the lactic acid is actually evaporating, just FYI. So if you taste your dough, it might actually be less sour after baking. Yeah, just because you're destroying some of the lactic acid, lactic acid, and some of it is evaporating, just FYI. So let's measure this one more time because I have been using different sourdough starters and it might be that the lactic acid, the pH is not the same everywhere. .8, 3.86, okay. Just using a little bit of baking powder. I never used baking powder before, so I have no idea how much I should be using. If you have tips, please do suggest it in the comments. Let's stir this back inside. And you can see that the baking powder is instantly activated. You see those bubbles popping up right there. I'm just gonna be waiting for 5 minutes now and then I'll measure the acidity.
5 minutes later.
Okay, let's test this now. Around 5 minutes have passed. And look at this, isn't this magical? Our pH went from around 3.9 to 4.1-ish, I would say. Maybe if I wait a little bit longer, it's even going to increase a little further. So this hack is definitely going to work. I'm going to be baking a bread now, and then I want to measure the final acidity of the bread after baking. This is amazing. I didn't expect this to work. Science rules. The dough has been planted. Okay, that was a nerd joke. Anyways, so let's check. After mixing, this is the dough of my bread. Look at the pH. Well, I now introduce a little bit more of additional flour. I'm gonna monitor this and I'll show you once it's ready before the bake and then after the bake. So the pH has actually increased and we're now at 4.25. And this is interesting because the actual bread has increased in size, and I doubt that's just the baking powder. This is also the sourdough starting to ferment again. So the baking powder is really nicely counteracting the increase in acidity. I'm gonna bake this now, so mark 4.25. Let's see how the bread looks like after the bake. Alrighty, so this is the final bread, and for this discard bread, not discard, slow fermented sour bread, you never get that much of an open crumb anyways, so it's relatively dense. But some reported that it's a little bit too sour. I kind of like the sour taste, but let's put this to the test now and see the final pH. And that's why I love this pH meter. And look at this. The pH is even higher now. And that's interesting because I baked this for a quite long period of time as well. And after baking, the pH increases slightly. But enough talking, let's put this to a test and give this bread a shot. So I'm expecting it not to be too sour. It's great. It's very, very mild. Definitely less sour than I'm used to. I baked this one really nicely. It has a great crust as well. Good consistency here, relatively wet. This to me is the perfect bread. Personally, I like the slightly more sour taste to it, but I would say this experiment definitely worked. So baking powder allows you to reduce the acidity in case you want to do that. So yeah, hope you enjoyed this video and I hope that you learned something new.